Well, hi and welcome aboard to another English language A-level video. Now this one is a real beauty because this one is all about language change. So I'm assuming that you are an A-level English language student, that you're creeping ever closer towards your exam, and you need to really revise all of your language change AO2 concepts, in which case this video is designed for you. So here are the 48 concepts that I think are absolutely crucial for language change. And so you're doing this for, yes, your English language. This is the AQA, English Language Paper 2, both sections A and B. The section A would be an evaluative essay question. Section B, you might have been given 2 articles on the discourses section which are about language change, and therefore in your opinion article, which is your question 4 at the end, you would have to show your AO2 knowledge. So it's there for paper 2, and also maybe you're one of these people that wants to do some kind of language change topic for your language investigation as well, in which case the AO2 concepts are important for you too. So without any further ado, let's get on with our 48 language change A-level theories and concepts. And our first one is diachronic and synchronic variation. Now, diachronic variation just simply means language change. It's a posh word for it. It's the historical development of language over time. Chronos in Greek means time. Dia means 2, so it literally means the difference between 2 points in time. So for example, if you are studying the language of how car advertisements have changed over time, that is a study of diachronic variation, something that you could do in your language investigation and something that you might get, for example, in your meanings and representations paper 1. So diachronic variation is a posh word for language change, and it's the cousin of synchronic variation, which essentially means language diversity. So synchronic variation refers to language diversity at one time. When you synchronize your watches, it means that you all set your watches at exactly the same time. Okay, so the study of language of a newspaper front pages on a single day, that is synchronic variation. Okay, language change, concept number 2, our old friends, prescriptive and descriptive approaches to language. Well, of course, prescriptivism promotes the idea of a fixed language, where you are prescribing a set of standard rules. Think of your doctor. You go to the doctor and they prescribe you some medicine, saying you should take these tablets. So prescriptivism is promoting the idea of a fixed language. Here is Dr. Johnson talking about, languages. Tongues, like governments, have a natural tendency to degeneration. That's Dr. Johnson in the mid-18th century. Now that is prescriptivist, isn't it? Tongues, meaning languages, he's arguing that languages naturally degenerate over time. Okay, and that is the opposite to a descriptivist point of view. So descriptivism describes language usage, but it avoids passing judgment on language change or variety. It's essentially what we do on this course. We seek to kind of observe and explain and set language in context without applying kind of value judgments about that language. Here is the wonderfully alliteratively named Henry Hitchings, who says we can see diversity of language permitting through its richness greater possibilities for creativity and adaptability. So there is somebody who seems to be celebrating language change and language diversity. Okay, we're now into language change concept number 3, which is about Old English. Now don't use that noun phrase Old English in a casual way to describe, let's say, the language of Jane Austen, writing 200 years ago, or even William Shakespeare, writing 400 years ago. No, 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 because Old English is the language spoken in England from 449 AD, which is the start of the Anglo-Saxon invasions, right through to round about 1066, 1100, when the Norman French had established power in the country. So it's a big old wodge of time, about 600 years. That is Old English. And in that time, Old English featured significant regional variations, so that if you were up in Northumbria, your English would be very different from Mercian English, which is the current day Midlands, which of course would be completely different from Kentish English down on the southeast coast. So lots and lots of regional variations. You had not only the language of the Anglo-Saxon Jutes, but also you've got mixed in there the language of the Vikings, who brought with them Old Norse, and some of the most common words that we have today come from that language, like for example they, T-H-E-Y, the third person singular subject plural pronoun. Okay, what else can we say about Old English? Well, sort of lexically quite narrow and grammatically quite complex. So if you only have a few words in your vocabulary, what you tend to do is you are innovative with compounding. So in Old English you get lots of lexical compounding. Why use the word sea when you could use the word whale road? Isn't that an improvement? Can you imagine it? And that's a wonderful, what's called a kenning, which means that in Old English times the poets used to combine words together in surprising ways to give you new words. So whale road for the sea. And of course there was lots of grammatical complications in Old English. So for example, wide-ranging plural inflections. So for example, it would be egru. The plural form of eggs was egru, but then the plural form of something else like child would be children, one that has survived in current day English. So lots of wide-ranging inflectional endings, and of course gendered as well. So the further that you go back in time, the more complicated the grammar becomes. Let's have a little slice of Old English. So I'll read this out aloud and you need to guess, well, what kind of famous text this is. Fader ure ddwdde arto on hefonom, sydd in nama gehelgod, to bekommen ddyn riche, gewethe ddyn wile, on earthen swaswa on hefonom. Yes, full marks, the beginning to the Lord's Prayer. And just have a look at the first line there. Fader ure. So we're seeing here that the syntax, the word order, is different from current day English. Now, of course, you can do that because you've got different inflectional endings on the ends of words, which means, like Latin, you can place a word in different parts of the sentence and it's still going to mean the same thing. Okay, so we've got Father, our, you who are in heaven. So you can see that it is different from current day English, but some of the grammar words, like the prepositions, for example, are exactly the same as current day English. So on there, are, art. We can see here that is, we've got an inversion of the graphemes, the S and the I. We've got to, the same, etc. So quite unfamiliar to current day speakers, but if you do a little bit of grammatical digging into there, you can see that there are some close similarities in the grammar, the grammatical words, between current day English and Old English. Let's move on to Middle English. So Middle English is spoken and written in England from 1066 to 1500. So the beginning of the Norman invasion and the beginning of the Reformation in 1500. What characterises this? Well, a heck of a lot of Norman French language influences that are coming into the language. So we have, according to David Crystal, and you're not going to argue with him, 10,000 words entering English from Norman French in this period. Want some examples? Here are ones to remember. From the semantic field of military, we have the word battle. From the semantic word of cuisine, ironically itself, a Norman French word, mutton. And from the semantic field of law, judge. So those are three good examples of words that come into English in this medieval Middle English period. So what happens is that some of those complicated inflections that I talked about in Old English, they drop away, and therefore the syntax becomes more stabilized because you've got to actually nail down where words are in the sentences, like subject, verb, object, in order for the sentence to cohere. Okay, so we've got those complicated English inflections from Old English simplifying or disappearing. Now, do you want to hear a little bit of Middle English? Seems you don't really have a choice. I'm going to read aloud to you a little bit of Middle English, and you tell me from which famous text this comes. Befell that on that saison on a day, in Southwark at the Tabard as I lay, ready to wenden on me pilgrimage, to Canterbury with full devout courage, at night was coming into that hostelrie, well 29 in a compagnie of sundry folk. Yes, the clue was in the proper noun Canterbury's. So this is Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, which was written in the late 15th century. And you can see here that it's a bit more understandable than Old English. And certainly all of those grammatical words, they are nailed down completely here, where you've got the indefinite article a and the definite article the. You've got the first person singular possessive pronoun my. You've got prepositions like to and on. So all those are very recognisable. And the key characteristic of this is French borrowed words. So a lot of these words that have an E on the end, like pilgrimage, courage, hostelrie, compagnie, these are all Norman French borrowed words. All right, we're now going to move into early modern English. So this is language spoken from 1500 to round about 1700. So roughly, this is the age of the Renaissance period. We have got in this era a lexical explosion. It's making a hell of a mess all over the carpet. We've got this dramatic increase in the range of borrowed lexis. So here are three examples. So we have a word like electricity that arises as a result of scientific innovation. We have a word like coffee, which results from international trade. We have another word, this one comes from Malay, which is bamboo. And so this shows that this is the period which is the start of colonialism. And in this period also, we have strong influence from two sets of texts. So we've got Big Bill, we've got William Shakespeare, 1564 to 1616. So in his 37 plays, there are various neologisms. So something like 2,000 words come into the language. First citation in Shakespeare plays. Words like, and I've got some written down here, lonely, critic, swagger, and bedazzle. 4 words that are first citations in Shakespeare plays. And the other set of texts, which is very, very influential on English, of course, is the King James Bible, which is produced in 1611 and gives birth to all sorts of idiomatic proverbial expressions that we have today, like, for example, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Okay, let's show you a little bit of early modern English. This is from a Shakespeare play, but the question is, this Shakespeare play, which one is it? In sooth, I know not why I am so sad. It wearies me, you say it wearies you, but how I caught it, found it, or came by it, what stuff 'tis made of, whereof 'tis born, I am to learn. And such a want-wit sadness makes of me that I have much ado to know myself. So these are the first lines from Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. We have some archaisms, some obsolete lexis which seems to have disappeared out of the language. Sooth, very common early modern English word meaning the truth. We have want-wit, meaning silly or stupid. We've got ado, like fuss and confusion. But if you think about it, of all of the, let's say, 40 words that you've got here, we've only got 3 words which now we are struggling to translate. That just shows how close this is to current English today. Okay, so now we're going to move into modern English. So modern English is defined as the language that's used from 1700 onwards. So in this early period of modern English, the grammarians and lexicographers get their dirty hands on the language. And so you've got people like Lindy Murray, who is producing his grammar book in 1794 called English Grammar. And you've got the good doctor, Dr. Johnson, who is producing his dictionary in 1755. So these are initial attempts to sort of codify the language. The idea being that England, sort of the British Empire, is spreading across the world, and yet writers are saying, look, we don't even seem to be able to control our own language. So these are attempts to really codify the language and lay down the rules. Okay, so we've got, at this time in the modern English period, from 1700, we've got colonisation happening, we've got the Industrial Revolution, we've got huge advances in communication technology, and therefore the vocabulary of English continues to expand, even to this day, to take into account all of these things. And you would have to say that English has the widest active vocabulary of all the 6,000 languages in the world today. So it's got a global nature as English, and that has led to significant variation. So, for example, you've got the emergence of various international varieties of English, such as Canadian English. Okay, we're now going to climb into our 7th AO2 language change concept, which is about lexical coinage, which means making words up. So a society develops, and therefore you need additional words to reflect these new concepts. And here are some of the processes that are included in lexical coinage. Occasionally you do get neologisms, where you can actually tie down the origins of a word to a particular time and a place and a person, e.g. Hobbit, created by the writer of Lord of the Rings, Tolkien. Borrowing, for example, bungalow from Hindi. Compounding, where you take two words and you push them together, user-friendly. You've got clipping, where you take an existing word like perambulator and you clip off parts of it, clipping. Here are some more. Blending. This is where you take two words and you crunch them together. So breakfast, lunch, let's call it brunch. We have acronyms like LOL, where you take the letters of each consecutive word and run them together, which is slightly different from an initialism like OMG, where you articulate each individual first letter. You have affixing, a very common way of coining new words, where you take an existing morpheme. A morpheme means a unit of meaning in a word, and then you put on the front of it a prefix, or you add on the end of it a suffix, and that changes the meaning of the word. So we have this drunken Australian in 2002 who writes in his blog about a selfie. Excuse me, I just dropped my phone, it's a selfie. And thus is born a new word. So you've got the single morpheme of self, you've got the new suffix of E, the diminutive suffix being put on the end there, as beloved by Australians. And lo and behold, 10 years later in 2013, selfie is the Oxford English Dictionary Word of the Year. Okay, so a good example to remember there of affixing. We also have conversion, which basically means taking a word from one word class and then using it in another word class. So we had the proper noun Google, and now we start Googling. So we're starting to use that as a verb rather than simply using it as a noun. And of course we have eponyms. I love eponyms. So eponyms are those words that have come into the language from the names, the proper nouns of people or places. Like the 18th century Earl, the Earl of Sandwich, who was so devoted apparently to his gambling that he wouldn't leave the betting table and demanded that his servant bring 2 slices of bread with a big chunk of meat in between them. And the rest is history. Oh, one more, back formation, which I think is always a strange one. And so this is where you take an existing word like location and then you lop off the end of it and convert it into a new word class. So the abstract noun location becomes the material verb locate. That's called back formation. Okay, so lexical coinage is a really interesting process because what it essentially demonstrates is change from above. These are not produced by committees of learned people getting together and deciding, let's create a new word for whatever it is. These arise out of need, okay, because language is a socio-cultural phenomenon. It reflects society, so we need the creation of new words. Now, I suppose the opposite of that are archaisms. So archaisms are words that fall out of use, and this usually happens as a result of shifts in attitudes in society. Here are a couple of examples that are mentioned in the AQA textbook. We have alienism, the study of mental illness. Now, because we've developed a far more knowledgeable and sensitive understanding about mental health issues, we're not going to call people who are struggling from these sorts of things aliens. So the word has disappeared. Secondly, we've got charabang. This is one of those wonderful open-top bus carriages that unfortunately you don't see around, but were very commonplace 100 years ago. So two examples of words that have fallen out of the language because of shifts in society. Now, sometimes lexis just disappears for no apparently good reason other than shifts in fashion and style. And, you know, you do get words like perfectly reasonable, useful words like hence and thence, two good deictical words, hence meaning from here, thence meaning from there, which just simply fall out of use due to changes in fashion and style. Okay, we are halfway through this first video about the AO2 language change concepts. We're now going to get into language change concept number 9, the good old inkhorn controversy. Now, an inkhorn is one of those vessels where you put your pen and your ink, right? And it's a metonym. So the inkhorn controversy arose from complaints made in the Renaissance period, and here we're talking about the 16th to the 17th century, about writers borrowing lexis from classical languages like Latin and Greek and Romance languages like French, Spanish, Portuguese and Italian. So not everyone is a fan of new words coming into the language, and Thomas Wilson is definitely not a fan, because in the 1550s he writes a book called The Art of Rhetoric, where he refers to these newly borrowed words as strange inkhorn terms, and so he considered them sort of pretentious and artificial. So in this period, people got very heated about it. You had big heated debates among writers about what form of words, vocabulary to use. Should we be using straightforward Anglo-Saxon lexis, like word hoard, for example, or should we be importing new vocabulary from the Romance languages or the classical languages that express more sophisticated ideas, such as dictionary? So this is the inkhorn controversy. We're now into our 10th language change concept, and hands up if you know who that is. Very good. So that is Jonathan Swift. So he is the Irish writer from Dublin, and he protested. He was a writer, very famous writer, of course, the writer of Gulliver's Travels, one of the earliest English novels. And he didn't like what was happening in terms of vocabulary in the early 18th century. And he wrote a pamphlet which protested against lexical development in 1712. It was called Proposal for Correcting, Improving and Ascertaining the English Tongue. And ascertaining there means to fix. So essentially what he wanted to do, he wanted to stop language changing. So he had all sorts of peeves, so things that he disliked. He had a prescriptive dislike towards clipping. I mean, mob, how vulgar is that when you could be using the Latin mobile vulgus? Vagueness in language, didn't like that. Unnecessary contractions was like disturbed with the little apostrophe D on the end. And of course these ridiculous new coined words, like for example banter and shuffle. I mean, these words will never catch on, surely. So unsuccessfully he attempts to establish an English academy in 1712. He wants to purify the language, and he doesn't get support from the monarch at the time. And it's a good example here of the difficulty in trying to establish lexical change from above. like we said before, lexical change usually happens change from below, and it's very difficult to change from above. We're now on to language change concept number 11, which is Dr. Johnson. And so Dr. Johnson wrote his dictionary, which he started in 1747 and completed in 1755. And his dictionary was really famous because it was regarded as the sort of preeminent work of its time. It contained definitions, it contained literary examples, it had something like 42 different words that were defined. So it was utterly and completely unique. Many of the definitions today wouldn't pass mustard, and they seem to us kind of like amusingly subjective. So, for example, he defines a lexicographer, which means a person who writes dictionaries, as a harmless drudge. And what's interesting about Johnson is that when he sets off on his enterprise, what he's trying to do is ascertain the language. He's trying to fix the language and stop it from changing. And as he goes through this process of lexicographer, he realizes actually that that's a futile attempt. He describes it as being like attempting to lash the wind, and he moves to a more descriptive appreciation of language change. No dictionary of a living tongue can ever be perfect, since while it is hastening to publication, some words are budding and some are falling away. So it's a good quotation to remember. Some words are budding and some are falling away. So again, it demonstrates the difficulty of trying to prescribe language from above. And there he is. He doesn't look happy, does he? Our 12th one is about Neosemy. So semy on the end of a word means semantic meanings, and neo means new. So this is the process whereby words acquire new meanings. Perfectly natural process. Here are some examples. So some words broaden. Take the word holiday, medieval English, holy day, when you are praying to God, and now we're eating ice cream at Saltburn. Narrowing. So once upon a time, narrowing was an all-purpose word that meant any kind of food. Pass me a banana, I need a bit of meat, you might say, and that word has narrowed to mean animal flesh. We have amelioration, where a word like pretty, which once meant sly or cunning, has taken on more positive meanings. And the opposite of that is pejoration, a word like villain, which just meant somebody working in the fields. In medieval times, perhaps because of the prejudices of the Norman overlords, that pejorates over time and takes on more negative meanings. We have weakening, where a word like soon, once upon a time meant immediately, and now just means a little bit later. And of course we have metaphor, so you grasp an idea, so you've got the literal meaning of grasping, which is now used in a metaphorical way. Oh, and let's not forget euphemistic uses of language as well, where we have the military using phrases like collateral damage, which seems okay on the face of it, until we realise it means wiping out whole villages of women and children in battle. Euphemistic uses of language. So these are all really interesting processes of neosemy for you to remember. The etymological fallacy is a nice little noun phrase for you to be using in essays or articles. This is the refusal by some prescriptivists to acknowledge that a word's meaning might deviate from its original meaning. So if you've been reading the AQA textbook, you'll have seen the Daily Mail article in there called The Pedant's Revolt, in which the Daily Mail writer Simon Heffer complains about various words deviating from their original meaning. One example is the word dilemma, and his argument is that in ancient Greek, when that word was coined, dilemma meant a choice of two things. So therefore it's absurd for us to be using it when you've got more than two options to make on a particular decision. So that's a good example of somebody committing the etymological fallacy of mistakenly believing that a word can only have one single pure true meaning. Polysemy is the concept of having these multiple concurrent meanings, and which word in the English language is adjudged to have the most meanings? Well, according to the 1989 OED, I know it's going back a bit, set, the humble word set, S-E-T, is defined at having a colossal 430 different meanings. So Lexis changes in meaning as a result of all sorts of factors. Now some of these factors are external factors like cultural changes, technological innovation or shifts in convention and ideas. So the example that's given in the textbook is about the noun guy and the twists and turns in the meaning of that word over time. But Lexis can also change in response to kind of internal factors as well. So for example, you take a phrase like computer virus. So here we've got the linkage of one word to another because of some perceived similarity. That is Neosemy. We're now going to go on to language change concept number 13, which is good old PC language. So politically correct language. And what is the point of PC language? Well, what it tries to do is attempt to sort of minimise social inequality by reforming the language so that we avoid language that is insulting, marginalising or controlling other people. Okay, so if you are a user of politically correct language, you might argue that, well, language not only influences the way that you think and behave, but it also determines your perception of reality. So that's an idea that is called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. It's mentioned in the textbook. It's called linguistic relativity, and it's the idea that language determines thought. So here are some examples of politically correct language that has developed over time. So instead of saying half caste, we are more likely to be saying mixed race. And instead of saying disabled person, you're more likely to be saying person with mobility issues, i.e. putting the person at the front and then the issue with their physical mobility later on in the phrase. So two good examples of PC language. And of course there are many, many critics of PC language. Some might argue that this is actually limiting people's freedom and therefore is to be avoided. Other people are kind of sceptical that simply by changing the names for things, are you actually tackling people's prejudices? And Steven Pinker always has something wise to say. He calls it the euphemism treadmill, when what happens is that you change the name for something and that all that happens is that that new name you've started using starts to get tainted with the old prejudices. The euphemism treadmill by Steven Pinker. Language change concept number 14, we're going right back to Old English and lettering. So here, let's talk about Christian missionaries because they're the ones to blame. They were the ones that first brought the Roman alphabet to England, and it happened in the 590 something, in the late 6th century. Prior to this, Old English, when it was written down, which was rarely, it was written down using runes, which are straight lines that could be carved into stone and wood. So it's Christian missionaries who bring the Roman alphabet to England. And if you look at Old English texts, they do not include some of the most common consonants that we use today in English. No J, no Q, no V, no K, and no Z. And so you also get additional consonants which we don't have today. So you've got the UTH sound, which is a D with a hook, which we would show with a TH digraph. That's the UTH. You've got the yog, which is a Y sound. You've got the thorn, which is another TH sound. This time it's a voiceless interdental fricative, and it looks like a P with a long stem. So that's your thorn. You've got your win, which looks like a back to front A, which is W sound. And then you've got, of course, you've got the famous long S. Okay, and on top of that, in terms of vowels, you have other vowels that are different from English, most famously the ash grapheme. So if you slap together an A and an E, as in urfader, that is your ash grapheme. So some quite fundamental differences between Old English lettering and current day English lettering. So the fact that your Roman alphabet was actually not designed for an English pronunciation is one of those historical reasons for the non-phonetic nature of today's English spelling. English spelling is mad, and there's one good historical reason why that is the case. Right, this is our penultimate one that we're doing about language change on this video. and this is number 15, which is about spelling change. So as we've just said, Old English, phonetic, and so you had considerable accent diversity across England. So that meant that a single word could be said and spelt in all sorts of different ways. So take this word here, K-N-Y-G-H-T, or is it K-N-Y-H-T, or is it C-N-I-C-H-T? So a single word pronounced and spelt in different ways in different parts of the country. The other thing that happens when the Storm Normans arrive is that the French scribes start writing down Old English, and they introduce new letters. So they create the K, W, X, Z and TH. So they're importing them from Norman French conventions, and they're starting to write English with them. Eventually, when we get to the end of the Middle English period, we've got printers arriving on the scene. So we've got William Caxton in the late 15th century, and he went some way to establishing an agreed spelling system, although it would be a mistake to say that William Caxton kind of invented English spelling. That's completely wrong. But he set in process a kind of a process of standardization. And he chose, of all the different regional dialects across the country, he went for East Midlands dialect, which was the dialect spoken in London, Oxford, Cambridge, and that rich agricultural belt that's north of London. And that became the kind of forerunner of Standard English. So it became this high prestige form of spelling. So there's nothing special about Standard English. It's linguistically no superior, say, to Geordie, but it's got status and prestige. It's a dialect with status. And so he starts spelling things in a reasonably consistent way, although even William Caxton, when you're reading his books, there is inconsistency in there. So one minute he's spelling book B-O-K-E, and the next minute he's going B-O-O-K-E. The last language change concept that we're doing on this video is about the Great Vowel Shift, sometimes known as the Great Bowel Shift. This huge shifting of bowels that happens from 1400 to 1600. What it is, it's this gradual change in pronunciation that affected vowels. Very, very slow process. So medieval word doon becomes English, current day English, down. Leaf becomes life. Nama becomes name. So this happens very slowly over something like 200 to 250 years. Some linguists have suggested that the Great Vowel Shift was a deliberate attempt to diverge from the fashionable French pronunciation of the Middle English period, because if you've been to war with the French, right, you no longer want to sound French. So some linguists have suggested it's like a conscious effort to diverge away from that medieval language of power. And the reason why we're talking about it now when we're talking about spelling is that the Great Vowel Shift, of course, impacted on spelling, because what it did was it led to this widening gap between established spellings, which are beginning to take root in the 15th, 16th century, and of course changing pronunciation, the Great Vowel Shift. Okay, I'm going to stop it right there, and that's the end of our first video, and watch out for video number 2 on language change. Thank you.